All right, guys, for this last video, part three for chapter 12 on food safety concerns, I really just wanted to focus in a little bit on the last section here is 12.7 on food preservation techniques. It's just a little bit of vocabulary and some key things that we can look at as we think about how we are storing food, perhaps even preserving food and that sort of thing. We should realize, number one, that there is a shelf life of our food, and I think we realize that things will last at certain temperatures and after certain preservation techniques for a limited amount of time, depending on how it's preserved, depending on how you're keeping it, whether it's in the refrigerator. You're talking about days, maybe up to a week. You're talking about a freezer. Just because you put something in the freezer doesn't mean that that's going to last forever in the freezer. And so there is a shelf life even for items that we commonly freeze, whether it's even vegetables or meats or whatever. Or is it a canned product? Have we purchased it from a grocery store, or is it something that we have canned ourselves? We'll talk a little bit about that also. But there is a shelf life for any of these things, and so that's that time period that a food item can be safely stored before there's any kind of spoilage that takes place. One of the terms we'll look at here, fermentation, that is a food preservation technique, and we'll look at some others as well. But this is used in different types of foods. Not as much, perhaps, maybe in pickling anymore, as it is in things maybe like winemaking or things if you make your own yogurt. Again, a lot of people don't. You just buy it from the grocery store. Same thing about pickles. Even home canning techniques really don't use fermentation for pickling very often. That's usually we use things like vinegar that's already been fermented to go in our pickle recipe. But technically, it could be used to make fermented pickles, or fermented cabbage is very common as well. And there's different forms of that, whether it's kimchi or sauerkraut or something like that. Sterilization, though, that is a process that basically kills everything, destroys all living microbes that's in a food item. And that's usually done by heat, pressure and heat kind of combined. It could even be done by radiation. And so we'll look at a couple of techniques there for sterilization, but that's the process of basically killing all of the microbes in that particular food source. So take a look at these terms here that are associated with food preservation methods. Some of these overlap a little bit, or you're using kind of a combination of these to preserve food. And so, of course, we realize that heating is, we all use that to cook our food, and that's going to help preserve it as well, because that's going to help to get rid of any microorganisms that may be present. But after that, we talked about in the last video, you need to make sure that you're storing food at the proper temperature, whether it's something fresh or something that's been cooked and you're storing it as a leftover. If you got that kind of danger zone temperature you're trying to avoid, or trying to minimize anyway, 40 to 140. And so heating is obviously a good preservation method as well. Some things use curing techniques, and so curing is here, and that's basically when you're using something like chemicals for example, meats. You have a cured meat, whether it's something like bacon or ham or sausages or something like that. That's cured by adding certain chemicals. Usually, it's salt cured or sugar cured type of meats. Along those same lines, smoking also helps to cure, and it's naturally using the flavor of the smoke, but even chemicals within that smoke penetrate into the food item. Usually it's a meat product, to help preserve that meat. I'm going to skip chilling and freezing just for a second because really these techniques, adding salt, sugar, smoking, curing, what you're really trying to do, not only are you adding flavor to the meat or whatever you're preserving, but you're also drying it out. And so by removing moisture, these processes will help to dry by adding these chemicals, but by removing the moisture, you're basically limiting the ability of microorganisms to actually grow and multiply. Now, it may not prevent it forever. Again, you've got a shelf life for those particular food items, even if it's cured, even if it's preserved in that way, even if it's dried out. But it helps to preserve for a long time. And so drying kind of goes along with these up here. Chilling, freezing, we mentioned this before, put things in the refrigerator. You have limited preservation there, but it does slow down the growth. You do have to be careful about things like Listeria, that bacteria that seems to do okay in cooler temperatures, but most bacterial growth is going to slow down, not stop, but it will slow down. Even freezing temperatures don't necessarily, that's not going to usually kill the microbe, but it will slow it down. But when you bring it out back to room temperature and you're thawing it, that microbial growth, if it has any microbes there, will continue. So you do have to be careful with freezing. That's where we need to make sure that we're packaging things carefully that go in the freezer. We need to label everything carefully. We need to date everything carefully and use those within a 3 to 4 month type of a time span, maybe up to a year, depending on what you're dealing with. Fermented, we mentioned a little bit already. Canning, I'll mention a little bit more about this. Some of you may have done a little bit of home canning, and in the picture you can kind of see there somebody's canning some pickles there. So you may have done some canning, home canning at home. And then the last one here is using radiation, irradiating the food source. And so we'll mention a couple things about that as well. But if you want more information about these types of methods, make sure you check out table 12.8 in the textbook. So let's look at a couple of additional things here. Home canned foods. You do have to be careful. Definitely follow the guidelines. A lot of people that do can things at home, they have usually a guidebook, recipe book that they're following. You do have to be careful with low acid foods. And so most of the time now, it's been a little while, it's been a few years. I used to do quite a bit of home canning. I'd have a garden and I'd try to either preserve things either in the freezer or sometimes I do a little canning as well. Low acid foods, beans, corn, potatoes, those don't have a lot of acid content. And so you do have to be careful, especially with this bacteria called Clostridium botulinum here. Just about all, I guess, of the Clostridium group produces some kind of toxins. And so Clostridium botulinum, you may recognize this as botulism, or that food poisoning that it can cause. The problem here with this particular group of bacteria is that they produce and can survive in a spore state. And so your normal heating methods, like if you're canning something like on the stove or whatever, those normal heating methods don't kill those spores, and so they may survive and they may start to multiply. The other thing here is Clostridium is anaerobic, so it doesn't require oxygen. So for that, you would have to use a pressure canner. And so again, you need to kind of understand what you're doing, do a little research. It's not that difficult. You just got to follow the guidelines. You need to know, if you find a canning book, it's going to tell you which of these vegetables, need to have a pressure canner, how long that you need to pressure can it, that sort of thing. And so just follow the recipe. And then, the high acid type foods. So maybe you've done tomatoes before. Not all tomatoes are high acid. There are some different varieties that are lower, different heirloom type varieties that are lower acid foods, but most of the tomatoes that we normally can are in the higher acid content. And so they do just fine in a water bath canner rather than a pressure canner. And then some people add a little extra acid to it. They may add a little bit of lemon juice to kind of, lower that pH down a little bit, increase the acidity. Irradiation, not something that we think about that often, maybe, but certain food items do go through this process to try to kill and really try to sterilize those by getting rid of microorganisms, pathogens, bacteria. And so, things that get irradiated could be meat products, it could be eggs, it could be even produce, fruits, vegetables, can be irradiated. They expose it to radiation. Usually it's like an X-ray type of a radiation source. And that tries to prolong the safety of the food. Now, some people don't like the idea of foods being hit with X-rays or other radioactive radiation, and so it's supposed to be very safe. It says that this process does not make the foods radioactive. You can go do your own research. I've done that as well. You can go to the FDA, you can go to CDC, and it has some articles there about irradiation. One thing to look for, and I put the little picture there. This is called the Radura symbol here. And so this is on any packaging. It's required by the FDA to include this symbol on any food item, meats, vegetables, whatever it is that has gone through the irradiation process. Last couple of things we'll look at for the end of this chapter is what about pesticides? Now, we don't want anything contaminating our food items, our food source, and that includes chemicals. And so pesticides are, any kind of chemical substance that's used to get rid of those pests, really, those unwanted organisms. And you can see the different examples here. And most of the time you can tell by the name what it's trying to control. Insecticide, trying to control some type of insect. Rodenticide, controlling rodents, mice, rats is what you're usually thinking of there. Herbicides are, killing off weeds, unwanted plants, and unwanted weeds that may be growing around the crop that you're trying to grow. Fungicides, trying to get rid of any fungi. And so there are guidelines, the USDA, and they try to have guidelines there to have certain tolerances that are allowed in a particular food area or crop. And of course, we can always look for organic type of foods sources if we're concerned about pesticides, to try to find those that are free from any type of chemical pesticide control there. But we do have to be careful, right? And so there's been studies that suggest that pesticides are potentially harmful, that get into our that are in our foods, that could be harmful to humans. And so kind of think of this, once a pesticide is applied to a particular crop, it's going to end up in kind of like one of four places. It could just remain in the soil and not cause any harm to anything. It doesn't get transmitted, so there may be pesticides remaining in the soil. It could be taken up by the plant, and depending on what part of the plant that you eat, potentially it could be part of the plant there. Potentially there could be pesticides that get you have some runoff, and it may soak down into the groundwater, or may get into a nearby stream and kind of make its way into a water supply. It could be carried to other locations by the wind as it's being applied. And I've heard of people that had, maybe a commercial grower that has sprayed nearby a residential area, and the wind blows those chemicals over into someone's yard, and actually caused, they were spraying some kind of Roundup chemical, some type of herbicide, and the herbicide kind of drifted in the wind and caused some trees and things to be hurt and harmed in the neighboring residential area. So it can happen. And so we do have to be careful. And so what do we need to do? Well, again, one thing is you could buy organic. I know that's a little more expensive. Another thing that we could try to do is to, make sure things are washed, our fresh fruits and vegetables, and make sure that we're washing those. We kind of mentioned that on a different video, but, kind of making sure that we're doing a good job of rinsing, washing these just in case there's any residual chemical left on that produce. And then anytime that we can, we should try to follow what's called an integrated pest management system, trying to control pests in different ways rather than just relying on chemicals to do that. Sometimes chemicals may be necessary. I get that. But there's, especially if you have a home garden, I don't have a very large garden, but I do have a home garden usually each year, and I try to find ways that I can control pests without using chemicals. And so sometimes, it's trying to introduce some helpful insects to the garden area. Ladybugs, for example, they're very helpful. They help, get rid of some of those unwanted insects. You can try planting some different types of herbs, especially those that are more aromatic around some of your garden plants, and that kind of distracts some other insects and herbivores. You can use some essential oils that are, even though they're technically chemicals, but they're a lot safer than some other types of pesticides. Things like peppermint oil, eucalyptus oil, you can kind of put around in the garden area, and that helps to distract insects and things. I've never tried it. I've heard of people using coffee grounds around some of their plants and things. One easy method is just to try to hand pick. Again, if you're talking about a farming industry, obviously they can't go through and hand pick every insect. But if you're talking about your garden that you have, a common insect that I see a lot of times if I plant squash, you have these little insects, we just call them squash bugs, and they get on the underside of the squash leaf. Each morning or a couple times a week, I'll just kind of walk through the garden, pick those up, pick them off the plant, and take care of them so that that's just a little pest management rather than relying on any kind of pesticide there. So see what we can do to kind of limit the use of pesticides, one, and then of course don't forget, like I said, washing our produce, and perhaps even buying organic if that's an option there. Thanks, guys. Hope this helps.